You feel it before you see it, a tremor in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. The Via Sacra stretches before you, Rome's most sacred street. But today, something is wrong. The usual morning sounds merchants hawking their wares. The clatter of wagon wheels on ancient stone have been swallowed by an unnatural silence. Then you hear it. Drums. Not the martial thunder of Roman legions, but something else entirely. A rhythm that seems to pulse from somewhere deep in the earth, primal and hypnotic, growing louder with each heartbeat. The crowd around you parts like water, and that's when you see the procession. At its center, a figure in a golden chariot pulled by white horses, wrapped in silk that shimmers with colors you've never seen worn by any Roman man. The figure's face is painted, lips stained crimson, eyes lined with kohl in the Eastern fashion. But it's not a woman. It's your emperor. And behind the chariot, carried by 100 sweating slaves, comes a massive black stone that seems to drink in the sunlight. The air itself feels different now, charged with something that makes your skin prickle with a fear you can't quite name. Before we step into what happened next, I'd be fascinated to know where in the world you're watching this from. It never ceases to amaze me how a story from nearly 2,000 years ago can still reach across continents and centuries to find us all asking the same questions about power, identity, and what happens when someone dares to rewrite every rule. The year is 219 CE, and the Roman Empire, the greatest political machine humanity has ever constructed, is about to be transformed into something no one could have predicted. The figure in that chariot is barely 16 years old, ruling under the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but the whole empire will come to know him by another name, Elagabalus. That name itself is borrowed from his god Assyrian sun deity, whose worship involves ecstasies and transformations that make Rome's staid religious ceremonies look like funeral rites. Within months, this teenager will attempt something that emperors with decades of experience never dared, to remake Roman civilization from the ground up, starting with its most fundamental assumptions about power, gender, and the nature of the divine itself. The question isn't whether Rome will survive the attempt. The question is what such an attempt reveals about the fragility of everything empires claim is eternal and unchangeable. But to understand how a Syrian priest's grandson ended up on the throne of the Caesars, we need to rewind 4 years to a military camp in the eastern provinces where the temperature of Roman politics was about to reach its boiling point. The legions stationed in Syria had been grumbling for months. Their emperor, Macrinus, had made the fatal miscalculation of cutting their pay, always a dangerous gamble with men whose loyalty is measured in silver. Into this powder keg walked Julia Suemius, a woman whose ambition could have lit the night sky. She brought with her a 14-year-old boy and a lie so audacious it bordered on genius. The boy, she claimed, was the illegitimate son of the beloved Emperor Caracalla, conceived in secret and hidden away until the time was right to reclaim his birthright. It was completely untrue, but it was exactly what the soldiers wanted to hear. Picture that moment in May 218 CE when the legion first laid eyes on the boy. He stood before them draped in purple silk, his movements graceful and strange, his face painted in ways that made hardened veterans uncertain whether they were looking at a prince or a priestess. He didn't speak to them like a Roman general would, with blunt, martial rhetoric. He spoke to them about destiny, about divine will, about a god who had fallen from the sky in the form of a black stone and chosen this boy as his vessel on earth. The soldiers, far from home and hungry for meaning as much as money, saw something in him that they couldn't quite name. It might have been charisma. It might have been the promise of better pay. Or it might have been something darker, a collective hunger for the kind of transformation that only comes when all the old certainties are burned away. Whatever it was, they knelt, and in kneeling, they set in motion a revolution that would shake the foundations of Roman civilization. The civil war that followed was brief and brutal. Emperor Macrinus marched south with his loyal troops, confident that he could crush this Syrian upstart with overwhelming force. But something extraordinary happened when the two armies met. Macrinus's soldiers, seeing the exotic splendor of Elagabalus's retinue, hearing the intoxicating rhythms of those Eastern drums, witnessing what appeared to be religious ecstasy rather than mere military discipline, simply changed sides. It wasn't a battle. It was a conversion. Within weeks, Macrinus was dead, his head sent to the boy emperor as proof that even entrenched power crumbles when confronted with something it has no framework to understand. The teenager, who had never commanded troops in a real engagement, had just conquered the Roman Empire through sheer force of personality and the promise of something new, something unprecedented, something that made the old Roman way feel tired and lifeless by comparison. The journey from Syria to Rome took months, and every report that filtered back to the capital made the Senate's blood run colder. The new emperor was traveling with an entourage that looked more like a religious carnival than an imperial procession. Syrian priests walked alongside Roman soldiers. Sacred prostitutes from the temple of Elagabalus shared the road with senators' representatives. And at the center of it all was the boy himself, whose gender presentation seemed to shift from day to day in ways that left observers struggling for adequate vocabulary. Sometimes he appeared in traditional Roman military dress, every inch the young general. Other times he wore flowing robes and jewelry, makeup and perfumes, presenting as something Roman culture had no official category for. The senators receiving these reports must have felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. They had seen emperors who were cruel, emperors who were incompetent, even emperors who were mad. But they had never seen an emperor who seemed determined to dissolve the very categories that Roman society used to make sense of the world. When Elagabalus finally entered Rome in the summer of 219 CE, he brought his god with him. The massive black meteorite of Elagabalus was installed in a newly constructed temple on the Palatine Hill, replacing traditional Roman deities as the focal point of imperial worship. But this wasn't just religious innovation. It was a declaration of war against everything Rome considered sacred. Within weeks, the young emperor announced that he would marry his god to Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom, a ceremony that had no precedent and made no sense in traditional Roman theology. It was as if he was deliberately taking the most sacred elements of two different religious systems and smashing them together to see what would happen. Some called it blasphemy. Others called it inspired syncretism. The emperor himself seemed unconcerned with either interpretation. He was operating according to a logic that belonged to neither Rome nor Syria, but to some third space he was inventing as he went along. The transformation of daily life in the palace happened almost overnight. The dignified ceremonies of previous reigns gave way to something that looked more like perpetual festival. Music echoed through the marble corridors at all hours, not the solemn hymns of Roman religious ritual, but the wild, driving rhythms of Syrian ecstasy. The emperor's appointments to high office began to follow a pattern that scandalized the aristocracy. He chose advisors and administrators not based on their family lineage or political experience, but on their physical beauty and their willingness to participate in his religious experiments. Men who had spent their careers climbing the ladder of Roman administrative service found themselves passed over in favor of Syrian dancers and chariot racers whose only qualification was that the emperor found them attractive. It was a complete inversion of every principle that supposedly governed Roman political life. But it was Elagabalus's personal behavior that truly shattered Roman sensibilities. He began to appear in public wearing women's clothing, not as a disguise or a theatrical performance, but as a genuine expression of something that Roman culture had no language to describe. Ancient sources, written by historians who were scandalized to their core, describe him seeking out physicians who might be able to transform his body, offering vast sums of gold to anyone who could give him female anatomy. He spoke openly about his desire to be treated as a woman in his relationships with men, taking multiple male lovers whom he referred to as his husbands. In one particularly infamous incident, he allegedly married a powerful athlete named Heracles in a public ceremony, with Elagabalus taking the role of the bride. Whether these accounts are completely accurate or exaggerated by hostile sources is still debated by historians. But what's undeniable is that Elagabalus was doing something unprecedented, using the absolute power of the imperial throne to explore and express a gender identity that Roman society considered not just improper, but literally unthinkable. The Roman elite watched all of this with mounting horror. These were people whose entire worldview was built on rigid hierarchies and clear categories. Roman citizens versus foreigners, men versus women, humans versus gods, sacred versus profane. Elagabalus seemed determined to dissolve every one of these boundaries, creating a world where everything was fluid, negotiable, subject to transformation. For aristocrats whose power depended on maintaining the traditional order, this wasn't just politically dangerous, it was existentially terrifying. If the emperor could declare himself both man and woman, both human and divine, both Roman and Syrian, what did that mean for all the other categories that held society together? If the most powerful person in the world could reject masculine identity, what did that say about the masculine virtues that supposedly justified male dominance? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were threats to the entire social order that had kept certain families in power for centuries. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite military force responsible for protecting the emperor, found themselves in an impossible position. They had sworn loyalty to the imperial office, but their definition of emperor assumed certain baseline characteristics: Roman birth, or at least assimilation to Roman values; masculine bearing and military competence; respect for the traditions that made Rome great. Elagabalus embodied none of these things. Every day brought fresh humiliations as they were ordered to enforce edicts that violated their deepest values, to protect a ruler who seemed to take pleasure in mocking everything they held sacred. The whispers in the barracks grew louder. How long could institutional loyalty survive when it required complicity in what soldiers saw as the active destruction of Roman civilization? How many orders could you follow before you stopped being a guardian of tradition and became an accomplice in its murder? By the third year of his reign, the cracks were beginning to show. The emperor's behavior grew more erratic, his religious ceremonies more elaborate and desperate. He announced plans to remove all traditional Roman gods from their temples, replacing them with images of Elagabal, not a gradual reform, but a wholesale replacement of Roman religion with Syrian mysticism. He began construction of massive public baths where men and women would bathe together, where the normal rules of Roman modesty would be suspended. He issued edicts granting legal recognition to forms of marriage and sexuality that Roman law had always condemned. Each new innovation pushed the empire closer to the breaking point, and the emperor seemed either unaware or unconcerned about the forces gathering against him. Julia Maesa, Elagabalus's grandmother and the true architect of his rise to power, watched the approaching catastrophe with calculating eyes. She had engineered one imperial revolution. She could engineer another. Her other grandson, Alexander Severus, was everything Elagabalus was not: conventionally masculine, respectful of Roman tradition, trained in law and administration rather than mystical theology. While Elagabalus burned himself out in increasingly frantic displays of divine authority, Maesa quietly built networks of support among the very people who had been most alienated by the current regime. The Praetorian commanders who visited her apartments never spoke openly of treason. They didn't have to. Everyone understood what was being discussed in those careful conversations about the empire's need for stability, about the importance of traditional values, about the tragedy of watching Rome destroy itself. The end came on March 11th, 222 CE. Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Soemias, were summoned to meet with Praetorian commanders, ostensibly to discuss security for an upcoming festival. But when they entered the designated chamber, they found not loyal protectors, but executioners. There was no dramatic speech, no theological debate, no last-minute miracle from the God who had supposedly chosen this boy as his earthly vessel. just soldiers doing what they believed necessary to save Rome from its own emperor. Julia Soaemias died trying to shield her son with her body, her ambitions finally consuming her in the most literal way possible. Elagabalus followed moments later, discovering that mortality was one Roman tradition even he couldn't escape. But death wasn't enough to satisfy the rage and fear that had been building for 4 years. The bodies were dragged through the streets of Rome, stripped and mutilated, finally thrown into the Tiber River like refuse. It was a desecration designed to send an unmistakable message. Everything Elagabalus had represented, the gender fluidity, the religious innovation, the challenge to Roman tradition, was being rejected with the same violence that had claimed his life. The reign that had promised transformation ended in a brutal reassertion of exactly the values he had tried to dissolve. Alexander Severus, just 13 years old, was proclaimed emperor within hours. His first acts were calculated to erase his cousin's legacy as completely as possible. The temple of Elagabalus was repurposed. The Syrian priests were dismissed or executed. The black meteorite was quietly shipped back to Syria, removing the physical symbol of Eastern influence from the heart of Rome. The edicts that had challenged traditional law were repealed. The courtiers who had enabled Elagabalus's experiments were exiled or killed. It was as if the empire was desperately trying to convince itself that the previous 4 years had never happened, that they were just a fever dream from which Rome had finally awakened. But you cannot erase what has been seen. Those 4 years revealed possibilities that could not be unlearned, questions that could not be unasked. Somewhere in Rome, people who had witnessed Elagabalus's reign, slaves who had glimpsed more fluid social hierarchies, women who had seen gender as something negotiable rather than fixed, followers of foreign religions who had experienced brief tolerance must have carried those memories forward. The official histories, written by aristocrats who approved of the Restoration, painted Elagabalus as a monster, an aberration, a cautionary tale about what happens when unworthy individuals receive power beyond their capacity to wield responsibly. But histories are written by survivors, and survivors have reasons to justify what they've done. The truth is more complex than either celebration or condemnation. Elagabalus was no saint. His reign was chaotic, his decisions often reckless, his use of power frequently cruel. But he was also something unprecedented, a ruler who used imperial authority to challenge fundamental assumptions about identity and the boundaries of what was possible. Whether you see his reign as liberation or catastrophe depends entirely on where you stood in Roman society's rigid hierarchies. For those who benefited from traditional structures, he was everything wrong with the modern world. For those who had been marginalized by those same structures, he was a tantalizing glimpse of what might be possible if the old rules could be swept away entirely. Standing in the Forum nearly 18 centuries later, you can still feel the ghost of those questions hanging in the air. The marble columns that witnessed Elagabalus's procession still stand, though the empire they supported has long since crumbled. The Tiber still flows, carrying away secrets and bodies and the dreams of those who thought they could remake the world. The reign lasted only 4 years, but those 4 years exposed something Rome spent the rest of its existence trying to deny: that all the supposedly eternal categories, gender, power, tradition, the boundary between human and divine, were more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. The boy emperor who claimed to be the sun god burned too brightly to survive, but the light he cast revealed truths that darkness could never completely hide again. In the end, perhaps that's the real terror of Elagabalus's story, not what he did to Rome, but what he revealed about the fragility of everything Rome claimed to be.